Shattering the silence of the howling Seattle storm, a low, guttural growl froze the emergency room staff at Mercer General Hospital. It wasn't the weather causing the panic, but a 70-pound German shepherd standing guard over a dying man's stretcher. While the hospital administration saw only a dangerous animal contaminating a sterile environment, rookie nurse Phoebe Jenkins saw a loyal soldier protecting his partner. Choosing to break every protocol to keep the dog by his master's side, Phoebe was publicly stripped of her badge and fired on the spot. Escorted out into the freezing rain, she believed her medical career was over. What she didn't know was that minutes later, 3 unmarked Black Hawk helicopters were about to shake the hospital roof, carrying a furious squad of Navy SEALs who leave no man and no dog behind. The rain in Seattle that November night didn't just fall, it felt like it was being fired from a weapon. At Mercer General Hospital, the emergency department was running on a skeletal crew, the weather having stranded half the night shift at home. Phoebe Jenkins, a 24-year-old nurse barely 3 months off her probationary period, wiped a streak of cold sweat from her forehead. Her scrubs were already clinging to her from the sheer physical exertion of a relentless 12-hour shift. She was exhausted, running on black coffee and adrenaline, but her eyes remained sharp, darting between the heart monitors of the overflowing trauma bays. Mercer General was a respected facility, but it was currently under the iron-fisted rule of Brenda Carmichael, the night shift nursing director. Brenda was a woman who valued bureaucratic compliance over human compassion. She walked the halls with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, her sensible orthopedic shoes clicking against the linoleum with the terrifying cadence of a metronome. To Brenda, the hospital was a machine, and the patients were mere data points. Anomalies were not tolerated. At exactly 1:14 a.m., the red trauma phone blared, its shrill ring cutting through the low hum of the ER. Inbound, the dispatch operator crackled over the radio. Male, late 60s, massive myocardial infarction. Unresponsive at the scene, currently in and out of consciousness. ETA 2 minutes. And, Mercer. Be advised, we have a situation with a canine in the rig. Brenda snatched the receiver from the wall. A canine? What do you mean a canine? This is a sterile trauma center, Unit 4. You do not bring an animal into my ER. Ma'am, we didn't have a choice. The paramedic's voice sounded strained, fighting against the wail of the ambulance siren. The dog broke through a glass patio door to get to the patient. When we tried to load the victim, the dog jumped into the back of the rig and physically placed himself over the man's chest. He's not attacking us, but he won't let us near the patient's airway unless he's touching him. Unacceptable, Brenda hissed, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. Hospital security will meet you at the bay doors. That animal is going to the pound. Phoebe stood near the nurse's station, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed a pair of latex gloves, snapping them onto her wrists as she followed Brenda out to the ambulance bay. The double doors slid open, letting in a violent gust of wind and rain that instantly soaked them. The ambulance screeched to a halt under the awning, its light bar painting the wet pavement in frantic flashes of red and white. The back doors flew open. "Move! We're losing him!" A paramedic yelled, leaping out and pulling the heavy gurney down the ramp. Lying on the stretcher was an older man with a face weathered like driftwood, his skin a terrifying shade of ashen gray. He was hooked to a portable defibrillator, his chest barely rising, but it was the creature beside him that commanded the entire bay. It was a massive German shepherd, its fur soaked and matted with rain and blood, likely from the shattered glass the paramedic mentioned. The dog was not frantic. He was terrifyingly focused. He walked perfectly in step with the moving gurney, his shoulder pressed against the metal railing. Around the dog's thick neck was a heavy-duty tactical collar, faded black nylon with a tarnished metal buckle. "Get that beast out of here," Brenda screamed, gesturing wildly to the 3 hospital security guards who had jogged out to meet the rig. "Catch poles! Get the catch poles!" The security guards hesitated. The German shepherd didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply stopped, turned his massive head toward the approaching guards, and lowered his stance, exposing a row of gleaming white teeth in a silent, deadly warning. It wasn't the behavior of a scared stray. It was the calculated perimeter defense of a highly trained operator. "He's okay. He's okay," the dying man on the stretcher rasped, his eyes fluttering open. He reached out a trembling, bruised hand. His forearm was corded with muscle and covered in faded military tattoos, including a heavily scarred Navy SEAL trident. Havoc, stand down. Instantly, the dog's posture changed. The snarl vanished. Havoc nudged his wet nose into the old man's palm, letting out a soft, heartbreaking whimper. "His name is Davis Pendleton," the paramedic shouted over the rain, handing the chart to Phoebe. The dog pulled the landline phone off the receiver and was barking into it when 911 dispatch picked up. "I'm telling you, this dog saved his life." "I don't care if it's Lassie," Brenda snapped. "This is a level 2 trauma center, not a petting zoo." "Security. Remove that animal immediately." As the medical team rushed Davis through the sliding doors into Trauma Room 1, the security guards finally made their move. Two of them lunged, throwing a heavy mesh net over Havoc. The dog thrashed, a raw sound of sheer panic escaping his throat, not because of the net, but because the stretcher carrying his master was disappearing behind the swinging doors. Phoebe watched in horror as the majestic animal was dragged backward across the wet linoleum of the lobby, his claws desperately scrambling for traction. "Stop! You're hurting him," Phoebe pleaded, stepping toward the guards. Brenda shot Phoebe a glare that could have frozen boiling water. "Nurse Jenkins, your patient is in room 1. Unless you want to join that mutt on the curb, I suggest you get to work." Biting her lip hard enough to taste copper, Phoebe turned and ran toward the trauma bay. But the image of the dog's desperate, intelligent eyes burned into her mind. That wasn't just a pet. That was a partner, and Phoebe knew she couldn't just let him be thrown away. Trauma Room 1 was a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, tearing Velcro, and shouted medical shorthand. Davis Pendleton's heart was failing. His arteries were severely blocked, and the ER physician, Dr. Eris Thorne, wait, doctor, Eris Miller, was fighting to stabilize him enough for emergency bypass surgery. Phoebe moved with practiced efficiency, hanging IV bags of saline and amiodarone, her hands steady despite the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. As she cut away Davis's soaked flannel shirt to place the ECG leads, she noticed the network of scars mapping his torso. Puncture wounds, jagged lacerations, and the unmistakable circular puckers of old gunshot wounds. This man hadn't just served. He had survived hell. "Pressure is tanking. 70/40, Dr. Miller announced, his brow furrowed. "Push another epi. We need to buy the surgical team 10 minutes. Davis's eyes suddenly snapped open. They were cloudy with pain, but fiercely lucid. His hand shot out with surprising strength, wrapping around Phoebe's wrist like a vice. "Havoc," Davis wheezed, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushing together. "Where is my boy?" "Sir, please try to stay calm," Phoebe said softly, leaning in close. "You're in the hospital. We're taking care of you." "Need him," Davis gasped, his oxygen mask fogging up. He's my heart. He alerts. He kept me alive in Kandahar. Don't let them take him, please." Phoebe felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at the monitors. Davis's heart rate was wildly erratic, spiking dangerously high out of sheer panic for his dog. The separation was physically killing him. "I'll find him," Phoebe whispered into Davis's ear, making sure Brenda, who was barking orders at a resident across the room, couldn't hear. "I promise you, Davis. I will find him." Davis's grip relaxed slightly, and he gave a faint, single nod before his eyes rolled back and the monitors began to scream again. "VFib. Charge to 200, Dr. Miller yelled. As the team scrambled to shock Davis's heart back into a rhythm, Phoebe was pushed toward the periphery. "Jenkins, go get the rapid infuser from storage," Brenda barked, pointing toward the hallway. It was the excuse Phoebe needed. She sprinted out of the trauma bay, but instead of heading to the supply closet, she bolted toward the front lobby. The security guards were struggling near the front entrance. They had managed to drag Havoc into the small vestibule between the inner and outer glass doors. The dog was pacing frantically, his nose pressed against the inner glass, leaving streaks of blood and condensation as he stared down the hallway toward Trauma Room 1. He was whining, a high-pitched sound of utter distress. "Animal control is 20 minutes out," one of the guards muttered, leaning against the door to keep it shut. "This thing is a menace. Let me take him." Phoebe said, stepping up to the guards. The security guard scoffed. No way, Phoebe. Brenda will have our heads. And yours. Brenda sent me. Phoebe lied smoothly, her heart pounding against her ribs. Animal control won't come out in this storm for at least an hour. Brenda doesn't want the dog terrifying the walk-in patients in the lobby. She told me to lock him in the abandoned physical therapy room on the East Wing until they arrive. The guards exchanged a look. The East Wing was currently under renovation and completely deserted at night. It made sense to get the dog out of sight. All right, but he's your problem, the guard said, cracking the door open and handing Phoebe the heavy leash they had clipped to Havoc's collar. The moment Phoebe took the leash, Havoc stopped pacing. He looked up at her, his intelligent amber eyes studying her face. He smelled the latex of her gloves, and more importantly, he smelled Davis's blood and sweat on her scrubs. He knew she had been with him. Come on, buddy, Phoebe whispered. Let's go. Havoc didn't fight her. He fell perfectly into step beside her knee, walking with a disciplined, silent gait as Phoebe hurried them down the dimly lit corridors toward the East Wing. She bypassed the physical therapy room and instead unlocked an old, sterile doctor's lounge that connected to the back access hallway of the ICU. It was a calculated risk. If Davis survived the ER, he would be moved to the ICU. From this room, Havoc would be less than 50 feet away from his master. She led Havoc inside, locking the door behind them. The room was sparsely furnished, with an old leather sofa and a sink. Phoebe quickly grabbed a clean plastic wash basin, filled it with warm water, and set it on the floor. Havoc drank greedily. As he drank, Phoebe knelt beside him, gently wiping the blood from his paws where he had cut them on the glass at Davis's house. It was then she got a clear look at his tactical collar. Tucked into a heavy canvas pouch on the collar was a laminated, metallic card. Phoebe pulled it out. It bore the seal of the Department of Defense, military working dog, expert classification name, Havoc K, 9044, Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGru Handler, CPO, Davis Pendleton, RET, status, active medical service alert, psychiatric assistance. Phoebe gasped. DevGru, SEAL Team 6. This wasn't just a veteran's pet. This dog was a highly decorated combat veteran himself, and legally, a federally protected medical service animal. Brenda had broken federal law by denying him entry. Phoebe reached into her scrub pocket. Before leaving the trauma bay, she had grabbed the small plastic belongings bag the paramedics had handed over. Inside was Davis's wallet, his keys, and a rugged, black tactical flip phone. Davis had mentioned a phone in the ambulance, according to the paramedic. He had mentioned his team. Before Phoebe could open the phone, the heavy wooden door of the doctor's lounge rattled. Someone was trying the knob. Jenkins? Brenda's shrill voice pierced the wood. I know you're in there. A janitor saw you walking down this hall with that filthy animal. Phoebe froze. Havoc stood up, stepping between Phoebe and the door, emitting a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Open this door right now, or I am calling the police. Brenda shouted, pounding her fist against the wood. Phoebe took a deep, trembling breath. She had no choice. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Brenda stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 security guards, her face a mask of absolute fury. Her eyes darted from Phoebe to the large German shepherd standing protectively at her feet. Have you lost your absolute mind? Brenda seethed, stepping into the room. You stole a dangerous stray from security, lied to my staff, and brought an unwashed, disease-carrying animal into a sterile hospital corridor? He is not a stray, Brenda. Phoebe shot back, finding a sudden surge of courage. She held up the laminated military ID card. His name is Havoc. He is a decorated Navy SEAL working dog and a legally prescribed cardiac alert service animal. By federal law, under the ADA, he is allowed to be with his handler. Brenda snatched the card from Phoebe's hand, barely glancing at it before tossing it onto the floor. I don't care if he has a Medal of Honor from the President himself. This is my hospital floor. The ADA has exemptions for sterile environments, and I classify this entire wing as sterile. You have jeopardized patient safety, violated hospital policy, and insubordinately disobeyed a direct order. Davis Pendleton is dying, Phoebe pleaded, her voice cracking. His heart rate is stabilizing only when he thinks this dog is safe. Taking Havoc away is literally killing him. We are nurses, Brenda. Our job is to heal, not to enforce pointless bureaucracy. Your job, Brenda said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper, was to follow my orders. As of this exact second, Phoebe, you no longer have a job. You are terminated, effectively, immediately. The words hit Phoebe like a physical blow. Fired. She had hundreds of thousands of dollars in nursing school debt. This job was everything she had worked for over the last 6 years. Give me your ID badge. Now, Brenda demanded, holding out her hand. Phoebe's hands shook as she unclipped her badge from her scrub top and dropped it into Brenda's palm. Security, Brenda snapped, pivoting on her heel. Call the city pound. Tell them we have an aggressive, biting dog that needs to be impounded and likely euthanized. If the mutt resists, use the stun batons. Then escort Miss Jenkins off the property. No, you can't! Phoebe screamed, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around Havoc's thick neck. The dog leaned into her, whimpering softly, sensing her distress. He hasn't bitten anyone. He's a hero. Watch me, Brenda sneered, turning her back and marching down the hallway. The two security guards stepped forward, unhooking black stun batons from their belts. They looked apologetic, but they were following orders. Come on, Phoebe. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Let go of the dog. Phoebe's mind raced. She had less than a minute before they took Havoc away, dumped him in a concrete cell, and likely destroyed him because he would never let a stranger handle him without his master. And Davis would wake up alone, if he woke up at all. Her fingers brushed against the heavy plastic bag in her pocket. Davis's belongings, the tactical flip phone. Just give me 10 seconds, Phoebe begged the guards, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Let me say goodbye to him, please. The guards hesitated, then lowered their batons slightly. 10 seconds, Phoebe. That's it. Phoebe turned her back to the guards, hunching over Havoc to shield her movements. She ripped open the plastic belongings bag and pulled out the thick, rubberized phone. It was an older military-grade model, built to survive an explosion. She flipped it open. The screen lit up, showing no password lock. She went to the contacts. There were only 3 names listed. 1. VA Clinic. 2. Neighbor Dave. 3. Weaver. Emergency only. Phoebe pressed the call button on Weaver. The phone didn't ring. It gave a single, strange electronic chirp, and then the line opened. There was no hello, just the sound of heavy rain in the background and slow, measured breathing. Who is this? A voice asked. It was male, deep, and carried an undertone of absolute, terrifying authority. My name is Phoebe Jenkins, she whispered frantically into the receiver, keeping her head down. I'm a nurse at Mercer General Hospital in Seattle. I have Davis Pendleton's phone. The silence on the line was instantaneous and profound. When the voice spoke again, the relaxed tempo was gone. It was razor sharp. What is Davis's status? He suffered a massive heart attack. He's in emergency bypass surgery right now. He might not make it. Phoebe choked back a sob. But I'm calling about Havoc. His dog. What about the K9? The voice tightened, sounding like a coiled spring. The hospital administrator fired me for trying to keep him safe. They refused to recognize his military credentials. They just called animal control to impound him, and the administrator told them to put him down for being aggressive. They're taking him away right now. I don't know what to do. Phoebe, the voice said, deadly calm. Where exactly is the dog right now? East Wing Access Hallway. Listen to me very carefully, Phoebe. Do not let them take that dog off hospital property. Delay them. Lie to them. Do whatever it takes. We are already in the air, 20 mics out from Seattle. We will be there in exactly 8 minutes. Who are you? Phoebe breathed. I'm Commander Thomas Weaver. Davis was my chief. Havoc was my point man. Keep them both alive for 8 more minutes. The line went dead. Time's up, Phoebe, the security guard said, grabbing her by the shoulder and pulling her roughly to her feet. The other guard stepped forward with a heavy leather catch loop, aiming it at Havoc's neck. Phoebe shoved the phone deep into her pocket. She had 8 minutes. She wiped her tears, her sadness instantly replaced by a burning, reckless adrenaline. She wasn't just a fight. She had a mission. You want him? Phoebe said, her voice suddenly steady as she grabbed Havoc's leash. You're going to have to go through me. The security guard lunged, his heavy leather catch loop aimed squarely at Havoc's neck. But Phoebe Jenkins was faster. Running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, she didn't just pull the dog back. She shoved the rolling laundry cart beside her directly into the guard's path. The heavy canvas cart, overflowing with soiled linens from the ICU, crashed into the guard's knees. He went down hard, his stunned baton clattering against the linoleum. The second guard froze for a fraction of a second, startled by the sudden burst of defiance from a nurse who, until 10 minutes ago, had been known for her quiet, compliant demeanor. Havoc, with me, Phoebe commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She didn't know if the dog would listen to a stranger, but Havoc's training was absolute. He sensed the hostility in the corridor and locked onto Phoebe as his temporary handler. He stayed glued to her left thigh, his broad chest forward, moving silently. Phoebe didn't run toward the main lobby. That would be a death trap. Instead, she bolted deeper into the East Wing. This section of Mercer General was slated for a massive renovation, and its labyrinth of outdated corridors, empty supply closets, and defunct administrative offices was a ghost town at 2 a.m. Stop her! Brenda Carmichael's shrill voice echoed down the hallway, laced with a venomous panic. She's unstable. Lock down the exterior doors. Phoebe heard the heavy thud of the security guard's boots recovering and giving chase. She took a sharp left past a set of swinging doors marked Authorized Personnel Only, pulling Havoc into the darkened, disused wing. The air here was stale, smelling of dust and old floor wax. She needed a defensible position, a place with a heavy door that security couldn't easily kick down. Her eyes scanned the gloom until they landed on the old radiology suite at the end of the hall. The door was solid core, lined with lead to prevent radiation leakage, and it had an internal deadbolt. In here, buddy. Come on, she whispered, throwing her weight against the heavy handle. It opened with a groan. She pulled Havoc inside and slammed the door shut, twisting the thick brass deadbolt just as the security guards rounded the corner outside. A second later, a heavy fist pounded against the wood and lead. Jenkins, open this door right now, one of the guards yelled, his breath ragged. You are making a massive mistake. Phoebe backed away from the door, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists. She looked down at Havoc. The German shepherd sat calmly at her feet, his amber eyes locked on the door. He wasn't barking. He wasn't pacing. He was executing a perfect, silent perimeter hold. We just have to wait, Phoebe whispered to him, sinking to the cold tile floor and pulling her knees to her chest. Just a few minutes. Outside, the chaos was escalating. Phoebe could hear the unmistakable click-clack of Brenda's orthopedic shoes approaching. Is she in there? Brenda demanded. Yes, ma'am. Lock the deadbolt. It's the old X-ray room. The door is lead-lined. We can't break it down without a breaching ram. I am not letting a fired, hysterical nurse hold my hospital hostage with a diseased animal, Brenda hissed. Call the Seattle Police Department. Tell them we have a disgruntled former employee barricaded in a hazardous room with a stolen, aggressive dog. Tell them she might be a danger to herself. And get animal control up here now. When that door opens, I want that dog darted and removed. Inside the dark room, Phoebe's heart plummeted. The police. Animal control. She pulled Davis's tactical phone from her pocket and stared at the dark screen. 8 minutes. That's what Commander Weaver had said. But what could a Navy SEAL do against the Seattle PD and a furious hospital administrator? She was trespassing. She had stolen a dog. She was going to be arrested, and Havoc was going to be put down. She buried her face in Havoc's thick, wet fur. The dog leaned his heavy head over her shoulder, letting out a low, comforting rumble in his chest. I'm sorry, Davis, she whispered into the darkness. I'm trying. High above the Puget Sound, fighting through a brutal Pacific Northwest squall, a formation of 3 unmarked MH-60M Black Hawk helicopters tore through the night sky. The rain lashed against the windshields, but the pilots, equipped with state-of-the-art night vision and terrain-following radar, flew with predatory precision. In the lead chopper, Commander Thomas Weaver sat rigidly in the jump seat, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his short, graying beard. He was clad in full tactical gear plate carrier, multicam fatigues, and a sidearm holstered at his thigh. His team, a specialized detachment of DevGru, SEAL Team 6, sat in absolute silence around him. They had just wrapped up a joint force training evolution at Joint Base Lewis McChord when Weaver received the emergency ping from Davis's phone. Davis Pendleton wasn't just a retired chief petty officer to them. He was a legend. He had trained half the men in this helicopter. And Havoc? Havoc was a 4-legged brother who had sniffed out an IED in Helmand Province that would have sent Weaver home in a flag-draped box. You do not abandon family. Axe-besuited. End quote. Pilot, ETA to Mercer General? Weaver barked over the internal comms. 3 minutes, Commander, the pilot replied, fighting a sudden downdraft. But sir, Seattle Air Traffic Control is screaming at us. We are violating restricted airspace over a civilian population center. They're threatening to scramble interceptors. Put them on my channel, Weaver commanded. A second later, a panicked ATC controller's voice filled his headset. Unidentified military rotary wing, you are in violation of Seattle restricted airspace. Divert immediately to Boeing Field or face immediate federal consequence. Seattle ATC. This is Commander Weaver, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Weaver's voice was like grinding granite. We are declaring a priority medical emergency under Federal Authority Directive Alpha 7. We are making a tactical insertion at Mercer General Hospital. Clear the airspace, or I will consider your interference a threat to a federal asset. There was a stunned silence on the other end, followed by a meek, "Copy that, Commander." Airspace cleared. Weaver switched his comms back to his team. Listen up. Our target is a hostile hospital administrator and local security who are attempting to illegally seize a decorated military working dog. The handler, Chief Pendleton, is critical in the OR. The asset, Havoc, is currently being protected by a civilian nurse named Phoebe Jenkins in the East Wing. We are not here to shoot anyone, but we are here to take control of this facility. Non-lethal compliance. Overwhelming presence. Let's move. Back at Mercer General, the situation outside the radiology suite had reached a boiling point. 2 officers from the Seattle Police Department, Officer Davies and Officer Callahan, stood outside the heavy lead line door. Beside them was a man from Animal Control holding a long, terrifyingly thick tranquilizer rifle. "Phoebe Jenkins, this is the Seattle Police," Officer Davies shouted, banging his flashlight against the door. "You are under arrest for trespassing and theft. Open this door immediately, or we will breach it." Inside, Phoebe squeezed her eyes shut. She looked at her watch. 7 minutes and 40 seconds had passed. "Phoebe!" Brenda's voice cut through. "This is your last warning. They are going to break the door, and you will go to jail. Give up the dog!" Phoebe stood up, her legs trembling. She placed a hand on Havoc's head. "All right, breach it," Officer Davies ordered. One of the hospital maintenance workers stepped forward with a heavy steel crowbar. He jammed it into the gap between the door and the frame, right at the deadbolt, and threw his entire weight against it. The wood splintered. The metal groaned. Crack. The deadbolt gave way. The heavy door swung open, flooding the dark radiology room with the harsh, fluorescent light of the hallway. "Freeze! Put your hands in the air!" Officer Callahan yelled, drawing his taser and aiming it at Phoebe. Behind the officers, the animal control worker raised the tranquilizer rifle, aiming the laser sight directly at Havoc's chest. "Step away from the animal, miss. He's classified as a dangerous biohazard." "No, you don't understand," Phoebe cried, stepping completely in front of the dog, shielding him with her own body. "He's a service dog. He belongs to a veteran. Shoot it!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Havoc. "Dart the beast before it attacks!" The animal control worker tightened his finger on the trigger. Then, the entire hospital shook. It didn't sound like a helicopter. The deafening, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of military-grade rotor blades vibrated through the concrete walls of the hospital, rattling the medical carts in the hallway and causing the fluorescent lights overhead to flicker violently. "What the hell is that?" Officer Davies yelled, looking up at the ceiling as dust rained down on them. "It's on the roof!" the maintenance worker shouted, backing away from the door. "Someone just landed on the helipad." Mercer General's helipad was designed for a standard, lightweight medevac chopper. It was not designed to handle the sheer, crushing weight of a fully loaded MH-60M Blackhawk, let alone 3 of them hovering inches above the concrete. Before Brenda or the police could comprehend what was happening, the stairwell door at the end of the East Wing corridor burst open with explosive force. A squad of 8 men flooded into the hallway. They didn't run. They flowed with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. They were massive, clad in dripping wet tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets, night vision mounts, and communications headsets. Assault rifles were slung securely across their chests, but their hands rested on them with practiced readiness. "Federal agents, secure your weapons. Step back." Petty Officer Gator Hayes roared, his voice booming over the sound of the rotors outside. Officer Davies and Callahan froze, their hands instinctively dropping away from their tasers. The animal control worker went pale, slowly lowering his tranquilizer rifle to the floor. You didn't need to be in the military to recognize Tier 1 operators. The aura of lethal competence rolling off these men was suffocating. Commander Weaver strode through the center of his men, his eyes locking onto the scene in the doorway of the radiology suite. He saw the splintered door. He saw the terrified 24-year-old nurse standing bravely in front of a massive German shepherd. And he saw the animal control dart gun on the floor. Weaver's face darkened with a fury that made Brenda Carmichael physically take a step backward. "Who is in charge here?" Weaver demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the noise of the hallway. I am," Brenda stammered, trying to muster her usual authority but failing miserably under the intense stare of the SEAL commander. "I am the nursing director. You cannot be here. This is a sterile hospital environment. We are in the middle of a police—" "Shut up!" Weaver snapped, the 2 words hitting her like a physical slap. He didn't even raise his voice, but the absolute command in his tone silenced the entire corridor. He walked past the stunned police officers, past the trembling hospital administrator, and stopped just a few feet from Phoebe. When Havoc saw Weaver, the dog's entire demeanor changed. The rigid, defensive posture vanished. Havoc let out a sharp, joyful bark and pushed past Phoebe, burying his wet muzzle into Weaver's tactical vest, his tail wagging so hard his entire back half shook. Weaver dropped to one knee. A sudden, immense softness washing over his hardened features. He took off his tactical gloves and buried his hands in the thick fur around Havoc's neck, pressing his forehead against the dog's head. "I got you, buddy. I got you. You did good." Phoebe stood against the wall, her knees finally giving out. She slid down to the floor, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush, replaced by overwhelming exhaustion and relief. Weaver stood up and turned his attention to Phoebe. He reached out a massive, calloused hand and helped her to her feet. "Phoebe Jenkins?" She nodded, too stunned to speak. "I'm Commander Weaver," he said gently. "You kept him safe. You bought us the time we needed. On behalf of the United States Navy, thank you." "Excuse me," Brenda interrupted, her face flushing red with a renewed, desperate need for control. "I don't care who you are or what branch of the military you claim to represent. That nurse is fired. She stole hospital property, endangered my staff, and that dog is going to the pound. Officers, do your job and arrest her." Officer Davies looked at Brenda, then looked at the 8 heavily armed Navy SEALs staring holes through him, and smartly decided to keep his mouth firmly shut. Weaver turned slowly to face Brenda. He reached into a tactical pouch on his chest rig and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. "Ma'am," Weaver said, his voice dripping with icy precision, "this animal is K9044, an active-duty federal asset with a security clearance higher than anyone in this building. His handler, Davis Pendleton, is a decorated war hero. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and further reinforced by the Federal Defense Authorization Act regarding military working dogs, your attempt to separate them is a federal offense. Weaver stepped closer to Brenda, towering over her. You didn't just fire a nurse tonight. You attempted to destroy federal property and endanger the life of a veteran. Now, I suggest you get out of my way, because we are taking this dog to his master. And if anyone tries to stop us, I will have you detained by military police before you can blink. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. Weaver turned back to Phoebe. Trauma Room 1, Phoebe said, finding her voice, but they were prepping him for emergency bypass. He might be in the OR. Lead the way, Phoebe, Weaver said, gesturing down the hall. We're going to see our brother. The procession through the corridors of Mercer General was something out of a surreal, high-stakes military thriller. Phoebe Jenkins walked point, her teal scrubs stained with Davis's blood and soaked from her frantic dash to the East Wing. Flanking her were 8 massive, heavily armed Navy SEALs, their wet boots squeaking rhythmically against the pristine linoleum, and right beside Phoebe, leading the formation with the focused intensity of a bomb-sniffing run, was Havoc. Nurses, doctors, and night shift orderlies flattened themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with disbelief as the squad moved past. No one dared say a word. The sheer kinetic energy radiating from Commander Weaver and his men was enough to silence the usually chaotic emergency department. Behind them, Brenda Carmichael trailed at a safe distance, furiously dialing her cell phone. She was calling Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of the hospital board. If the police wouldn't arrest this rogue nurse and her heavily armed accomplices, the CEO would undoubtedly call the governor to bring in the National Guard. Brenda was absolutely certain she was in the right. They're taking him to Surgical Suite B, Phoebe said, pointing toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. Dr. Miller was prepping him for emergency bypass. They pushed through the doors into the surgical anteroom. Through the large glass observation window, they could see the chaotic scene inside the operating theater. Davis Pendleton was on the table, surrounded by a swarm of green-scrubbed personnel. The harsh fluorescent lights washed out his already gray skin. Dr. Eris Miller was shouting over the frantic, high-pitched alarm of the EKG monitor. "I can't push the paralytic," Dr. Miller yelled, his voice muffled through the glass. "His heart rate is pushing 180 and completely erratic. The cortisol levels are through the roof. If we put him under while he's in this severe of a panic state, his heart will just stop. We need him calm, or he'll die on the table before I even make the first incision." Weaver stepped up to the glass, his jaw tight. "He's fighting it," Weaver muttered. "He thinks he lost the dog. He thinks he lost his point man. We need to get Havoc in there," Phoebe said, her voice shaking but resolute. Just then, the outer doors to the anteroom flew open. Richard Sterling, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s, stormed in. Despite the early hour, he wore a tailored suit, having rushed over from his penthouse 3 miles away after Brenda's frantic call. Brenda was right on his heels, a smug, triumphant smirk finally returning to her face. "Mr. Sterling!" "Thank God," Brenda gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Phoebe and Weaver. "This is the nurse I fired. And these men have stormed our facility, assaulted our security, and are attempting to bring a biohazardous animal into a sterile surgical suite." Sterling took one look at the heavily armed Tier 1 operators, then looked at the DoD-issued ID tag hanging from Havoc's collar, and finally locked eyes with Commander Weaver. Sterling had spent 20 years as a JAG officer in the Navy before transitioning to hospital administration. He recognized the Trident insignia. He recognized the DevGru patches. And he recognized a catastrophic legal and public relations disaster when he saw one. "Commander," Sterling said, his voice remarkably calm, extending a hand. "Richard Sterling, CEO. I assume there is a very good reason my hospital is currently occupied by the United States Navy?" "Sir," Weaver replied, not taking the hand. "Chief Davis Pendleton is dying on that table because your nursing director illegally separated him from a federally recognized medical alert service dog." We are here to rectify that violation before we lose a man who bled for this country. Sterling turned to Brenda, his eyes narrowing into slits. Brenda, did you deny a veteran his ADA-protected service animal? It's a dog, Richard, Brenda scoffed. It's a filthy, aggressive mutt. I was protecting the sterile environment. I followed protocol. The ADA requires reasonable accommodation. Brenda, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You don't call animal control on a decorated veteran's service dog. You find a way to make it work. You have exposed this hospital to a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit. Sterling turned back to Weaver, then looked at Phoebe. He needs the dog, sir, Phoebe pleaded. Dr. Miller can't put him under. Davis's panic over losing Havoc is causing a fatal arrhythmia. Sterling didn't hesitate. He hit the intercom button on the wall. Dr. Miller, this is Richard Sterling. We are sending a medical service K9 into the room. Prep him. Inside operating room 4, the atmosphere had deteriorated from controlled urgency to outright panic. The sterile, brightly lit theater was a cacophony of shrieking alarms, shouted medical shorthand, and the terrifying, irregular beep-beep pause beep of the electrocardiogram. Dr. Eris Miller stood over the surgical table, his hands resting lightly on the sterile green drapes covering Davis Pendleton's chest, waiting for the green light to make the primary incision. But that green light was slipping further away, with every erratic flutter of Davis's failing heart. I cannot push the induction agents. Eris, Dr. Gregory Lewis, the lead anesthesiologist, said from the head of the table. His eyes were wide above his surgical mask, darting nervously between the monitors and Davis's ashen face. His heart rate is bouncing between 170 and 190. He's in severe sinus tachycardia, flirting with ventricular fibrillation. His cortisol and adrenaline levels are completely maxed out. He needs this bypass right now, Greg, or that heart is going to burst. Miller shot back, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple before a circulating nurse dabbed it away. If I push the propofol and the paralytic while he's in this extreme state of panic, the sudden drop in blood pressure will flatline him, Lewis insisted, his fingers hovering over the IV port. His nervous system is locked in fight or flight. He's fighting the oxygen mask. He's fighting the room. He's looking for the dog. If I put him under now, he won't wake up. Through the large glass observation window of the surgical anteroom, Phoebe Jenkins watched the chaos unfold. Beside her stood Commander Thomas Weaver, his massive frame perfectly still, his eyes locked on his former chief. At their feet sat Havoc, the 70-pound German shepherd, letting out a high-pitched, vibrating whine that reverberated through the floorboards. Richard Sterling, the hospital CEO, pressed the intercom button mounted on the wall, cutting his voice directly into the operating theater. Dr. Miller, Dr. Lewis. This is Richard Sterling, the CEO's voice boomed over the alarms. We have the patient's medical service K9 out here. The handler's commanding officer and his primary care nurse advise that the animal is the only way to break the patient's panic cycle. I am authorizing a temporary breach of standard sterile protocol. We are sending the dog in. Inside the OR, Dr. Lewis looked up at the glass like Sterling had just ordered them to set the room on fire. A dog? In a cardiothoracic operating room? Are you out of your mind? The infection risk. The infection risk means absolutely nothing if he dies of cardiac arrest in the next 3 minutes, Dr. Miller barked, cutting the anesthesiologist off. Miller had seen Davis's iron grip on Phoebe in the trauma bay. He knew the man's sheer will to hold on was entirely tethered to his partner. Miller looked up at the glass and nodded firmly. Do it. Prep the animal and get him in here. Now! Phoebe didn't wait for a second order. She turned to Kelly Dawson, a veteran scrub nurse who had rushed out to the anteroom with a cart of sterile supplies. All right, buddy, listen to me, Weaver said, dropping to one knee and taking Havoc's massive head in his hands. He spoke to the dog not like a pet, but like a fellow Tier 1 operator about to breach a compound. You have a job to do. You are going in. You keep him anchored. You understand? Havoc offered a sharp single huff of air, his amber eyes completely focused. We need to minimize shedding and particulate transfer, Kelly instructed, her hands moving with lightning speed. She ripped open a package of heavy-duty chlorhexidine wipes. Phoebe, wipe down his paws. and his back. Phoebe fell to her knees, vigorously scrubbing Havoc's thick fur with the antiseptic wipes. The harsh chemical smell was overwhelming, but Havoc didn't flinch. He stood statue still, his muscles coiled tight beneath his coat. Next, Kelly unfolded a massive, sterile blue surgical drape typically used to cover equipment tables. "Help me tie this." They draped the heavy blue material over Havoc's back, wrapping it under his belly and tying the fabric strips securely, effectively creating a sterile surgical gown that covered 80% of his body. Finally, Kelly produced 4 oversized sterile surgical booties. "Give me your paw," Phoebe whispered. Havoc instantly lifted his right front leg. She slipped the blue booty over his paw and pulled the drawstring tight. She repeated the process until all 4 paws were secured. The resulting image was profoundly surreal. A battle-hardened, military-grade German shepherd standing in the bright lights of the surgical suite, entirely clad in sterile blue hospital gear. But there was nothing comical about his demeanor. He looked like a soldier in armor. "He's ready," Phoebe said, her voice trembling as she stood up. Weaver took the leash, holding it short. "Open the doors." As the heavy automatic doors to operating room 4 slid open, a rush of cold, highly filtered air hit the anteroom. The smell of iodine and raw ozone poured out. Havoc's ears pinned flat against his skull. The noise inside was deafening, the mechanical breathing of the ventilator, the suction machines, the frantic alarms. To a dog with hypersensitive hearing, it was a sensory nightmare. But Havoc was a DevGru K9. He had sat calmly in the deafening belly of a C-130 Hercules aircraft and walked through the concussive aftermath of flashbang grenades. A beeping hospital room was not going to break his focus. He didn't pull on the leash, nor did he shrink back. He stepped into the OR with a slow, deliberate, predatory grace, his padded paws silent against the sterile floor. Weaver walked him directly to the right side of the operating table, stopping just short of the sterile field surrounding Davis's exposed chest. Davis was thrashing weakly against the restraints, his eyes squeezed shut in agony, his lips moving soundlessly beneath the clear plastic of the oxygen mask. "Chief," Weaver said, his deep voice cutting through the mechanical noise of the room. "Stand down. Your relief is here." Weaver dropped the leash. Havoc stepped up to the stainless steel pedestal of the surgical bed. He knew he couldn't jump up. He knew the boundaries. Instead, he placed his 2 front, booty-covered paws onto the lowest rung of the bed frame, using it for leverage to stretch his long neck upward. Davis's right arm was strapped to a board, an arterial line protruding from his wrist, his bruised fingers curled inward. Havoc reached over the edge of the bed and pressed his cold, wet nose firmly into the palm of Davis's hand. He let out a low, rumbling groan from deep within his chest, a sound of pure, unconditional devotion. He nudged his head under Davis's fingers, forcing the man's hand to rest squarely on top of his skull. The reaction was instantaneous, defying every piece of modern medical technology in the room. Davis's eyes fluttered open, through the haze of pain and the fog of failing organs. His gaze locked onto the amber eyes of his dog, Havoc. Davis wheezed, the word fogging the plastic of his mask. His thumb weakly stroked the soft fur between the dog's ears. "Look at the monitor," Dr. Lewis whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. Phoebe, standing in the doorway, snapped her head up to the central display screen. The jagged, terrifying red line of Davis's heart rate, which had been spiking violently at 185 beats per minute, suddenly hitched. Davis took a deep, shuddering breath. He felt the solid, warm weight of Havoc's head beneath his hand. He felt the familiar, rhythmic breathing of his partner. The dog wasn't dead. The dog wasn't in a pound. His point man was right here, holding the line. The monitor beeped. 160. Davis's shoulders, previously rigid with terror, suddenly dropped onto the mattress. The frantic thrashing ceased entirely. The monitor beeped again, slower this time. 145. "Blood pressure is coming down," Dr. Lewis announced, his hands flying over his console as he adjusted the oxygen mixture. "Hypertension is breaking. Cortisol flush is receding." 120. 110. The shrieking alarms in the room began to silence themselves one by one as the parameters fell back into acceptable, though still critical, ranges. Havoc didn't move a muscle. He simply stood there on his hind legs, serving as a living, breathing anchor, pulling Davis back from the edge of the abyss. Heart rate stabilizing at 95, Dr. Lewis said, letting out a massive breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked across the table at the surgeon. Eris, I have a window. He's calm enough. I can induce. Do it, Miller commanded, picking up his scalpel. Push the propofol. Inducing now, Lewis said, pressing the plunger on the syringe. Davis looked at Weaver, then back to the dog. Good boy, Davis whispered, his eyelids growing heavy as the milky white anesthesia hit his bloodstream. Good boy. Within 10 seconds, Davis's eyes rolled back, and his body went completely limp. The ventilator took over, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. He was under. Dr. Miller looked at Weaver. Commander, we have to crack his chest now. The dog needs to leave the sterile field. Weaver nodded. He didn't even grab the leash. Havoc. Fall in. Instantly, the German shepherd backed away from the table, dropping his front paws to the floor. He gave Davis one last look, then turned and trotted to Weaver's side, sitting perfectly at heel. Save his life, Doc, Weaver said, turning on his heel and walking out of the OR with the dog. The heavy doors slid shut behind them, sealing the surgical suite. The moment they were back in the anteroom, the tension that had been keeping Phoebe upright finally snapped. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into a plastic waiting chair, burying her face in her hands as a wave of exhausted tears washed over her. Weaver unclipped his heavy tactical jacket, heavy with soaked rain and gear, and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. The jacket smelled of gunpowder, rain, and canvas. The other 7 SEALs had taken up positions around the waiting area, effectively securing the floor. They stood at the doors, the hallways, and the elevators, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Mercer General Hospital's surgical wing was now under the protection of the United States Navy. Havoc walked over to the glass door of the OR. He lay down on the cold tile, crossing his front paws, his nose pressed against the bottom of the glass. He wouldn't move an inch until his master walked out of those doors. Rest, Phoebe, Weaver said softly, taking a seat beside her. You held the line. We've got the watch from here. The violent Seattle storm finally broke just as the sun began to rise, casting a pale, washed-out dawn over the Puget Sound. Inside the surgical waiting area of Mercer General, the atmosphere was thick with an exhausted, heavy silence. 6 agonizing hours had passed since Davis Pendleton's chest was opened. The squad of Tier 1 operators hadn't moved. They stood like statues at the corridor, intersections, and elevator banks, their tactical gear slowly drying under the harsh fluorescent lights. Commander Thomas Weaver sat motionless on a plastic bench, his eyes fixed on the heavy double doors of the operating room. At his feet, Havoc remained in his self-appointed position, his nose pressed firmly against the bottom of the glass pane. Curled up in a chair in the corner, Phoebe Jenkins slept fitfully beneath the crushing weight of Weaver's canvas tactical jacket. She was completely drained, her nursing scrubs stained with the blood of a man she had risked her entire future to save. At exactly 6:42 a.m., the pneumatic hiss of the surgical doors shattered the quiet. Every SEAL in the hallway snapped to attention. Havoc scrambled to his feet, his ears perked, letting out a sharp, questioning whine. Doctor, Eris Miller walked through the doors, pulling his surgical mask down around his neck. His face was drawn, his eyes underscored by deep, purple bags of exhaustion. But as he looked at the heavily armed men and the massive German shepherd waiting for him, the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a tired smile. He's alive, Dr. Miller said, his voice raspy. A collective, silent breath left the squad. Weaver bowed his head for a fraction of a second, his shoulders dropping a single inch, the only outward sign of relief the hardened commander would allow himself. It was a quadruple bypass, and we almost lost him twice on the table, Miller continued, wiping his brow. But the man has the constitution of a battleship. We've closed his chest and stabilized his vitals. We are transferring him to the intensive care unit now. I've already spoken to the floor charge nurse. There is a wide recovery bed waiting for him, and there is plenty of room on it for his partner. Havoc let out a sharp bark, his tail whipping back and forth with frantic joy. 2 hours later, the rhythmic, steady beep of the ICU heart monitor provided a soothing soundtrack to room 412. The morning sunlight poured through the large window, illuminating the stark white room. Davis Pendleton slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the glare. His chest felt like it had been hit by a freight train, wrapped tightly in thick white bandages. But the first thing he truly registered wasn't the pain. It was the heavy, solid warmth resting firmly across his legs. He shifted his gaze downward. Havoc was curled into a tight ball at the foot of the hospital mattress, his chin resting on Davis's shin, snoring softly. Davis let out a weak, breathy chuckle, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "I told you he wouldn't leave your side, Chief." A deep voice rumbled from the corner of the room. Davis turned his head. Commander Weaver was sitting in a vinyl visitor's chair, his tactical gear finally swapped out for a clean Navy utility uniform someone had brought from the base. Standing next to him was Phoebe, wearing a fresh set of borrowed hospital scrubs, clutching a cup of black coffee. "Tommy," Davis rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We go where you go, Chief," Weaver smiled gently, stepping up to the bed. "But you don't owe me. You owe her." He gestured to Phoebe. "She's the one who held the line when the administration tried to take your boy." Davis looked at the young nurse. He remembered her from the chaotic haze of the trauma bay, the girl who had leaned in close and promised to find his dog. "You kept your word," he whispered. "I did, Davis." Phoebe smiled, wiping a tear from her own cheek. "He's a good boy. He belongs with you." The heavy wooden door of the ICU room clicked open, and Richard Sterling walked in. The hospital CEO carried a sleek leather folio, his expression remarkably softer than it had been hours prior. "Mr. Pendleton," Sterling said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "on behalf of the entire board of directors at Mercer General, I want to formally and deeply apologize for the abhorrent treatment you received upon your arrival. It was a disgrace, and I assure you, it will never happen again." Davis shifted weakly. "Where is the woman with the clipboard?" "Brenda Carmichael has been terminated with cause," Sterling stated flatly. "Her actions were a gross violation of federal ADA laws, hospital policy, and fundamental human decency. She was escorted off the property by security 3 hours ago. She will not work in hospital administration in this state again." Sterling then turned his attention to Phoebe. "Miss Jenkins, I spent the last hour reviewing the security footage from the East Wing. I watched you put your own body between a frightened service animal and an armed guard. You demonstrated exactly the kind of fierce, unwavering patient advocacy that this hospital desperately needs." Phoebe held her breath, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "If you are willing to stay," Sterling continued, "I am officially voiding your termination. Miller has personally requested you be transferred to the trauma surgical floor as his lead recovery nurse. It comes with a substantial raise and a permanent day shift. We would be honored to have you." Phoebe covered her mouth, a stifled sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaping her lips. The crushing weight of her student loans and her ruined career evaporated in an instant. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Thank you so much." As the CEO nodded and stepped out of the room to let them rest, Weaver walked over to Phoebe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid brass challenge coin. One side bore the eagle and anchor of the Navy. The other bore the unmistakable trident of SEAL Team 6. He took Phoebe's hand and pressed the heavy metal into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "You aren't in the military, Phoebe," Weaver said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute sincerity. "But last night, you acted exactly like a Tier 1 operator. If you ever need anything, no matter where you are, no matter what it is, you call the number etched on the back of that coin. We will rain fire from the sky for you." Phoebe looked down at the gleaming brass, completely overwhelmed. She looked back at the hospital bed. Havoc had finally woken up. The massive dog army crawled his way up the mattress, being incredibly careful to avoid the IV lines and the bandages. He rested his big, heavy head squarely on Davis's shoulder, right next to his newly repaired heart. Davis wrapped his scarred arm around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. They were together. The mission was a success. And as the morning sun fully illuminated the room, Phoebe Jenkins knew her life would never be the same. The story of Phoebe Jenkins, Davis Pendleton, and Havoc is a dramatic illustration of a profound, real-world truth. The bond between a veteran and their service animal is an unbreakable lifeline. For thousands of military personnel carrying the invisible, heavy scars of combat, a trained canine is not a pet, but a vital medical necessity that tethers them to reality and keeps their heart beating. While bureaucratic red tape and rigid protocols often blind institutions to human needs, it only takes one person with the courage to break the rules to prevent a tragedy. Phoebe's defiance highlights the essence of true medical care, advocacy, empathy, and the willingness to fight for the vulnerable. True heroes aren't just found on the battlefield. They are the people who stand up in the quiet, terrifying moments and simply refuse to back down.